Good afternoon, Jai Hind. Welcome back, everybody, to our day one, session one. I'm Satya Pulkuri, your host for this session. I'm the associate editor for the forum. Today, our first session will be on decoding the terror threat in South Asia. So, without any further ado, I extend a warm welcome to our session chair, Major General Shashi Asthana, sir, globally acknowledged strategic and security analyst, authored over 400 publications. Veteran infantry general with 40 years of experience at national and varied international fields. Held various key appointments in Army and the UN. TV commentator, speaker in various strategic military forums, United Nations organizations, and universities. Interviewed by various national and international news channels, newspapers, organizations on strategic, military, and UN-related subjects. Currently on Governing and Security Council Confederation of Education Excellence, CEE, International Organization of Education Development, and other UN organizations. On Advisory Board of Global Advisors Consultants Corporation, member of Expert Group Challenges Forum, IOED representative in the United Nations headquarters, Vienna, Austria. Chief Instructor of United Service Institution of India, the oldest think tank of India. Former Director General, Infantry in Indian Army. Distinguished expert in Bharat Center for Canada. Awarded twice by the President of India, twice by the United Nations, CEE Excellence Award for Nation Building by Governor of Haryana. Awarded for the International Diplomacy and Global Conflict Resolutions by IOED twice. A consultative body for ECOSOC and International Policy Commission, IPC India, by former Prime Minister of Moldova. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Respected members of Indic Research Forum, Mr. Yashesh, my co-panelists, and all the viewers. This is an important topic. You already heard the keynote speakers, and let me say in no uncertain terms that it couldn't have been at a better time when Taliban completes 1 year of rule in Afghanistan. That reminds us of so many things. The whole world condemns terrorism on paper as well as in every statement. But when it comes to doing it on ground or condemning it on ground, everybody condemns only what affects him. And whatever affects somebody else, people are generally quite, shall I say, they don't bother about it. And this has happened in a manner that a terrorist of somebody is a freedom fighter of other guy. And there is a double game going on, and this double game carries on all over the world. In addition to that, there are a number of countries who use terrorists to their advantage. And this advantage is at the cost of certain the peace of other countries and innocent life of other countries. And this is the dilemma as well as double gaming, which has led to a situation that till today United Nations has not been able to define terrorism. Now that is the biggest slap on the face of what we call as global war on terrorism. That you can't even agree on as to what is terrorism and what is not. We know that US as a superpower was there in Afghanistan for 20 years. The worst is that they struck a deal with UN designated terrorist organization. And therefore what we landed up was with a government of the terrorist, for the terrorist and by the terrorist. This is something wherein the whole world is witness to, where you have a UN designated terrorist as interior minister of a country. And the whole world is quiet about it. And everybody is talking, oh, my democracy in Ukraine. What nonsense. Here was a case where there was democracy in Afghanistan, which was thrown out of the window. and people worked it out with the terrorists, and terrorists are in power. And not only that, a large amount of modern weaponry went into the hands of terrorists. So this is what the reality is. What we discuss in UNSC is something different. And even in UNSC, we tried, there is a UN designated organization called as JEM. If the organization is a terrorist organization, how can the leader not be a terrorist? And you find one superpower, or not superpower, a P5 member, blocking it to say that he needs to study. I don't think he needs to, last 30 years after the Kandahar hijacking has taken place, if they still haven't found time to study, there is something basically wrong. So the question is that everybody plays this terrorism card to its advantage in a manner he feels appropriate. When people were negotiating with Taliban, everybody said, oh, Taliban 2.0 is different than Taliban 1.0. Now, all of a sudden, when you strike and you kill al-Zawahiri, then you realize that, oh, they were both were honeymooning together. So where is Taliban 1.0 and where is Taliban 2.0? So therefore, the terrorist doesn't change. It's an industry. In this industry, there is fundamentalism, there is proper CV of all these guys. They keep changing their organizations, they keep increasing. There is a lot of money involved, and they also there is narcotics involved, there is crime involved. It's a cocktail of crime, religion, to some extent fundamentalism, not religion, but fundamentalism. So that's another issue. And then again, when you come to the same country, same P5 country, China, when it comes to Uyghurs, ETIM, now, then they say no, we should have strategy of three evils being implemented by all SCO members, which says that okay, ETIM must be condemned, and that's how it is. So when we try to close it home, I'm sure Dr. Adil is going to speak a lot on that. But the fact is, you have AQIS and you have ISKP in Afghanistan. You have the FPAC region, Afghanistan Pakistan region, which is the hub of terrorism and has one of the largest conglomerations of terrorists in the world. There are certain terrorists, and then there is a competition between them. ISKP is getting stronger, Al-Qaeda goes weak, ISKP becomes strong, and all that. And when it is required, they also share their training infrastructure, logistic infrastructure. When it doesn't require, then also they need various areas to grow their influence and things like that. So this is all what is happening. Then you also have cases that in South Asia, like take the case of Khalistan, there were guys who were convicted. Those guys are sitting in Canada, and they are working without any problems on the payrolls of ISI of Pakistan, and creating perhaps professions all over the world. And when you talk of such so-called developed countries, they also make use of them in their elections, and that's why they don't want to extradite them. So this is how it is being played. Similarly, Pakistan. PTP is a terrorist. Jaish-e-Mohammed is not a terrorist. Hafiz Saeed is a social worker. Now these are the double gaming and these are the double standards which the whole world is talking about. Another thing which is very important, money matters. People keep saying jihadi mentality, this, that. Let me tell you, I was chairing an international session in which there was vice president of Uyghur Congress, and I asked that lady, ma'am, just tell me as to why is it that none of the Islamic countries, OIC doesn't back you. You yourself stay in Germany. The only guy who makes noise for you is USA. Why is it that all these Muslim countries don't talk about it? And she very rightly told me that money matters. So at the end of the day, money matters. So people who say, no, we are doing it for jihad, we are doing it for religion, we are doing it for all these people, we are doing it for our people, it is all nonsense. Pakistan can't speak a word against Uyghurs, against ill treatment of Uyghurs. Forget about other countries. Their own guys, their what imagine are in the re-education camp. Now they went to Pakistan, and their prime minister, the guy says, no, I really don't know what is happening there. So that's another trend which has come up, which I think I'm sure the panelists will analyze. That earlier terrorism was, if I see the global figures, what has happened is the terror incidents have increased. The terror casualties have decreased by about 1.8%. Terror incidents have increased by about 17 odd %. So therefore, what has happened is that there is an idea that, okay, let's use terrorism to create social unrest. And this we are facing increasingly in our country as well. I'm sure there are other countries and there are other dimensions of terrorism. Similarly, as I mentioned, the trend is terrorism has become an industry. People keep switching organizations. People can also hoodwink FATF, because when FATF has to come to Pakistan, then all the terrorists are sent to Afghanistan, and Pakistan very conveniently claims that I got no terrorists, and I don't know where these guys are. Similarly, the technological empowerment has taken place of these terrorists. Technological drone, they are using drones, they are using cyber, they are using whole fire attacks and things like that. So when we come to South Asia, let's put it as per the global terror figures keep changing, but then the fact is Afghanistan is now #1 as far as the countries affected by terrorism is concerned. And then there are a whole lot of Northeast African countries or North African countries. But then when it comes to South Asia, Pakistan, India, and other countries in the same order are affected. So we all are affected. We all need to have something to do. We need to do something about it. And with this, I will invite to throw light on this subject, Dr. Adil Rashid. He is the research fellow and coordinator for Counter-Terrorism Center in IDSA, that is Manohar Parrikar Institute of Strategic Studies and Analysis. He is author of two books. One was on countering the radical narrative 2020, and the other one was ISIS Race to Armageddon. That was he wrote in 2015. He has written many global research papers. He is a speaker of global repute. Without further ado, and he has also been in USI, so I had personal experience of working with him. So, without further ado, I will invite him to speak on approach to deal with growing influence of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in South Asia. Over to you, Dr. Adil. Can't hear you, Adil. Are you muted?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sir. It's an absolute privilege to be here at the Indic Research Forum with distinguished General Asthana and all the generals, General Rajan Kochar and all the eminent army officers and other officials and eminent panelists and audience. I would be today speaking mainly on ISIS. I have made a preparation on this subject. So I would just focus on the rise of the Islamic State in South Asia. I hope you are able to see my presentation. I hope it is visible. Can you confirm it?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. So I would like to first begin with this. Let me just, yes. We have seen that Al-Qaeda, which has been in South Asia for a very long time, for about 2 or 3 decades, and with most of its top leadership also being in this area, somehow it was not as influential in spreading its Hydra-like dangerous tentacles into South Asia as ISIS suddenly has become. And this is a very curious phenomenon. It needs to be studied, because if you have both the top leaders of Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden and Zawahiri, being killed in the Afpak region and being here for a very long time, Al-Qaeda could not spread outside the Afpak region into the rest of South Asia to the extent that ISIS has been able to. And this is something which we need to really worry about and think about, because ISIS is definitely a far more dangerous organization. And the fact is that ISIS, at the time of its establishment in the Syria-Iraq area in 2013-14, very soon after its establishment in West Asia, its branch in the Afghanistan and Pakistan area, it started maybe in late 2014, early 2015. And so this raises a question as to how come a more recent and a more devious, dangerous organization, which also has a belief system which is not in sync with the religious beliefs of the overwhelming majority of Muslims in the region, has been able to make such great, relatively more inroads than Al-Qaeda. And although ISIS did not draw as many recruits from South Asia as it was able to draw from other parts of the world, still ISIS completely overtook Al-Qaeda when it comes to its influence in South Asia. Now, one thing which we need to understand here is that both Al-Qaeda and ISIS are Salafi jihadist organizations. These are transnational groups, and they belong to the Ghair Muqallid, what we call in Islamic theology, Ghair Muqallid school of Islam, which actually means that they do not follow any of the 4 schools of Islamic jurisprudence. They do not, the 4 schools of Sunni Islamic jurisprudence. So they they differentiate themselves from even the Sunnis, let alone their animosity and hostility towards the Shia. However, it needs to be understood that Al-Qaeda is perhaps a little more pan-Islamic in that it sometimes dabbles even with some of the Shia extremist groups. You have Imad Mughniya, who was a member of Hezbollah, with whom...
Dr. Adel, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
We are only on your slide 1. Your slides are not moving unless
Yes.
you are already you are on slide 1 itself.
Okay, my
Are you
slides...
on slide 1 or you have moved on?
I have moved on, but I'll check why.
Yeah, now it has changed. Correct. Now we
Okay.
can see that.
Thank you.
So
I will not make it the bigger version. I'll just stick to the... I think it is still visible, so it's better.
yeah. It's visible. It's visible. Absolutely fine.
So because Al-Qaeda at times dabbled even with the Shia extremists, with the Hezbollah, and it carried out the Khobar attack with the help of Imad Mughniya, who was of the Hezbollah. We find that even Bin Laden's family members, Hamza Bin Laden, was raised in Iran. And even today's probably the successor of the possible successor of Zawahiri, Saif al-Adl, he's in Iran. It is thought that Al-Qaeda would be facing problems, but Al-Qaeda has had this more of a pan-Islamic approach, which also helped it to have good relations with the Taliban, which is a Hanafi Deobandi organization, which believes in the Hanafi school of Sunni jurisprudence. But Salafi Islam is basically against all the 4 schools of Sunni jurisprudence, let alone the Shia Jafri jurisprudence. And Salafi Islam has certain Salafi jihadism, particularly has certain concepts which are not very well understood by even the Hanafi Muslims of India. Its great emphasis on al-wala al-bara, on tawassul, on tasawwuf, on bid'ah. I'm not going to go into details of all that. Generally is not very well understood by the Indian Muslim. More important, its extreme emphasis on the Khilafah, on the Caliphate, is something which the Indian Muslim does not quite resonate that much. Why? Because when Islam came to India in the 10th or 11th century, the idea of the Caliphate was already in the decline, because the Abbasids were already in the decline, and in 1258 they were completely routed by the Mongol invaders. Baghdad was sacked. And so no Indian Muslim ruler ever had any kind of a linkage with any caliph. It itself never became a caliphate, nor did it have any kind of pay any obeisance to any caliph. Even the small caliphates which came after the Abbasids, or even the Ottoman Caliphate. In fact, at the time of the freedom struggle, it was more in opposition of British imperialism rather than any great linkage with the Ottoman Empire. Maybe just Hyderabad having some links with the Ottomans. Otherwise, there was no great bonding between Indians and any caliphate outside. So when ISIS talks about about any of the Salafi jihadi ideals, it hardly resonates in India. There is also the problem that the ISIS has, it does not glorify the rule of the Muslim rulers in India. It does not glorify the Mughals. It does not even consider Aurangzeb to be a good enough Muslim. They are against the idea of the king. They follow a very kind of a tribal egalitarian system, which they claim the Prophet approved of. And so they are against kingship. And so on so many counts, Salafism has issues in spreading in South Asia. Although Al-Qaeda was able to overlook all these problems and was able to side with the Taliban in the 1990s, many of its own members, people like Al-Zarqawi, who was here for some time in Afghanistan, and you had other jihadis, never accepted bin Laden's approval of the Taliban as a legitimate Islamic emirate. You had Abu Qatada, who openly came out against bin Laden, saying that he will not accept the Taliban 1.0 to be a legitimate Islamic emirate. And you find the same kind of animosity in much of ISIS literature. You find that ISIS radical literature, whenever it comes out and tries to spread it in India, it never refers to any of the Mughal glory. Unlike many of the Pakistani groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed and others who keep talk about reviving the Muslim glory in Indian history. So there is this tension which goes on. So despite all of this incongruence, the fact that ISIS was able to actually make an impact for itself in South Asia, which is mostly a Muqallid country, which regards the Hanafi and the Shafi'i schools of jurisprudence as its main system of Islamic law, is in fact remarkable that ISIS was able to do this. Now, one of the reasons for that is that Wahhabism or Salafism, every Wahhabi calls himself Salafi. Wahhabis generally regard the term Wahhabi as derogatory. They don't like to be called Wahhabis. Earlier, they used to call themselves Muwahhideen. Now they call themselves Salafis. Now, the Salafi ideology actually, in a way, started remarkably from India. The gurus of Abdul Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism in 18th century Arabia, the teachers, the Maulvis of Abdul Wahab, one Muhammad Hayat, was actually from Sindh. And he was a person who was indoctrinated by the ideology of Ahmad Shah Sarhindi, who was also from India. Ahmad Shah Sarhindi was a more radical kind of a Sufi who was opposed to the Sufi idea of Wahdatul Wujud, and he was a more hardline extremist ideologue. And it is his ideology which actually became even more radical in the works of Abdul Wahab. And so in that way, we can say that even the progenitor of Wahhabism in a way comes from India. But it was this ideology of Abdul Wahab which also influenced one Indian scholar, a very noted one at that. His name was Shah Waliullah Dehelvi, the guy who actually called Ahmad Shah Abdali to come to India and fight against the Marathas in the third battle of Panipat in 1760s. And this person actually went to Makkah, and it is possible, many people say that he went to the same educational institution around the same year when Abdul Wahab was there. When he comes back, he also starts moving against many of the Sufi beliefs, and he starts propagating Salafi ideas. And it is his son, Shah Abdul Aziz, who was perhaps more influenced by Salafism than his father himself. And in 1803, he issues a fatwa against the British Empire and declares the jihad against it. And one of the great fighters of Shah Abdul Aziz was Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi. Now, Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi is regarded as probably the first Wahhabi in India in the early 19th century. And his headquarters was in Balakot and in the NWFP region. So it was at that time that you find the base for today's ISIS being laid. It was here that he spread the idea that the Afghan tribes should not have just tribal affiliations. Their affiliations should be based on a Salafi version of Islam. It should be religion and not your ethnicity or your tribal association which should bind you together. And it was Ahmad Barelvi who actually laid down the foundation of Salafi extremism. Devbandi Islam actually tries to reconcile Salafism with Sufism. So it is a kind of an intermediate kind of a ideology which Devbandi Islam follows. And this we should understand that Devbandism sometimes veers more towards Sufism, and sometimes it veers closer towards Salafism. Many of the Sufi Barelvis consider Devbandis as closet Salafis. However, Devbandi Muslims consider themselves to be having both streams together. Now, with this Salafism being in the today's Afpak region at the time of the 19th century itself, it was, one thing should be understood, that even at that time, the Ahl Hadith movement was not as radical as Al-Qaeda or ISIS are today. Barelvi himself, the fatwa on jihad was against the British Empire and also against Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was an ally of the British. But Ahmad Barelvi actually reached out to many Hindu rulers to fight against the British rule, against the Maratha ruler of Gwalior, Hindu Rao, and which he wrote a very humble letter to him asking him to fight with him against the British. Many of the belief systems at that time, even Ahmad Shah Barelvi after his death, was considered to be somewhat of a saint, and that he would come back from the dead, which is a very anti-Salafi idea, that he's in occultation or things like that. So it was in the formative stages at that time that this radical idea. Still, you find that the person, I'm trying to move to the next slide, the person who establishes the ISIS-K in at this time in around 2015 is actually a person. His name is also Hafiz Saeed Khan, but he's a different Hafiz Saeed Khan, not the Hafiz Saeed of Lashkar-e-Taiba. He himself belongs to that Salafi ideology. He is a follower of Ahmad Shah Barelvi. and the Salafi ideology of Shah Waliullah Dehlvi and Abdul Wahab. And so he had issues. He was a friend of Baitullah Masood. In 2007, Baitullah Masood established the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is a Deobandi organization. He brought together 6 or 7 groups of Taliban in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa to fight against the Pakistani army because of its SWAT operations. And then he became an eminent member of that group, but because of his Salafi orientation, it was many of the other successors of Baitullah Masood, who after his death, people like Hakimullah and Fazlullah, who became the leaders of the TTP. And after that, this guy, Hafiz Saeed Khan, became even more radical and started attacking the Deobandi Hanafi mosques and seminaries. And he, in 2014, some people say in October 2014 or January 2015, he established this Tehreek-e-Khilafat, a Salafi organization, which eventually pledged allegiance to ISIS sometimes in January 2015. And he had this other friend of his, Shahidullah Shahid. So they started a small group with less than 1,000 people. But in the early days of ISIS, it was very difficult for them, ISIS-K, whatever you call them, they were finding it very difficult to make progress. And you find that Shahidullah Shahid was killed by American and Afghan forces in 2016 and 2015, and then Hafiz Saeed Khan was also eliminated in 2016. His brother Abdullah Orakzai was also captured in April 2020. But the really upswing in ISIS-K's fortunes happened once Taliban started negotiating with America. Once that happened, IS-K even started, its message started resonating with those Deobandi Afghans and the jihadi types who were against the Taliban having negotiations with America. And because of that, America also started taking action against IS-K. We know about the mother of all bombs, which was thrown under Trump's instructions in 2017. Many of the cave structures in Achin in the Nangarhar province were destroyed in the bombing. And then we find that ISIS-K, still the fortune started picking up a bit. However, ISIS was more effective in the rest of South Asia. In 2016, there was this Holy Artisan Cafe attack in Dhaka, which killed about 22 foreigners. Although the Bangladeshi authorities blame it on Jamiatul Mujahideen Bangladesh, the JMB, however, ISIS links are quite clearly there for that attack. But this was followed by the major terrorist attack of the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka in 2019, in which roughly 270 odd people were killed, including the 8 bombers. And that is said to have snowballed into the current crisis, because that attack actually stopped the tourists coming into Sri Lanka for a few months. And after that, the COVID pandemic started hitting Sri Lanka hard. So, so ISIS has been more active in the subcontinent. Many Indian young people started going to Syria, also to Afghanistan. And it is said that presently about 66 ISIS fighters are of Indian origin, according to recent reports. Now, after 2018 onwards, ISK has conducted attacks in the Afpak region also. It has killed about 149 people in Pakistan in 2021. And then there was this the August attack last year when ISK was blamed for actually killing 13 American soldiers and over 170 Afghans at the airport while America was withdrawing its troops. The dangerous thing about ISK is that it now openly is having ETIM members in its squad, and it is attacking Shia sites using ETIM and Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan IMU terrorists in its fold. It has also started launching rockets into Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and is trying to disrupt activities there. ISK is also increased attacks on Sikh Gurdwaras in Afghanistan, both in 2020 and this year, a couple of months back. They attacked Gurdwara Karte Parwan. And then you find a lot of radical material coming out of its e-magazines, Voice of Hind and Voice of Khorasan. And it openly talks about many of the issues which are happening in India at present, political issues, which is a very dangerous trend. Now, the future seems to be the prognosis, if we have to make, of the situation of ISIS-K. I'm not going into the Taliban issue, although there also there are big problems. It doesn't look very nice. Right now, ISK numbers are said to have grown from 1,000 to about 4,000, according to some UN reports. Independent sources sometimes put the figure as high as even 6,000 or 8,000 members of ISK. And the fact that in the southern provinces of Afghanistan, Nangarhar and Kunar, there are these drug routes which are actually helping ISK with the funding and also its international network, but it has also moved to the northern Afghanistan provinces of Faryab and Jawzwan, where also you find some of the Ahle Hadith Salafi orientation sections of that population, which it is trying to exploit. The fact that as the Taliban's burden of governance grows and it is unable to deliver, which it certainly does not look like delivering, ISK is perhaps becoming the only major opposition to Taliban amongst the jihadis in that country, and it is openly criticizing Taliban for its policies and for actually what it says breaking bread with the Western powers and China. And so it is trying to project itself as the only legitimate pure jihadist force in the country. And that rhetoric and that narrative is only going to get stronger in the future. There is also many experts who believe that there is some kind of a linkage between the Haqqanis and the ISIS-K, and that the ideological whatever Deobandi or Salafi thing actually doesn't matter so much. It is the Haqqanis right now. The Shahab al-Muhajir, who's the commander of the ISK, was a previous member of the Haqqani, a commander in the Haqqani network. So that is also something which we have to keep into account. The large number of people joining ISIS-K right now are Taliban dissidents who do not approve of many of the things the many-faceted Taliban is doing. Many of the former soldiers of the Afghan army, unfortunately, are also joining ISIS-K. And one of the reasons for that is that ISIS is a much better paymaster. It pays more and in time than other jihadi groups in Afghan region. But a more disconcerting thing which is happening is that in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and in J&K itself, you find that Salafi Ahle Hadith ideology is spreading through many new schools and colleges. Now, I do not believe that we should try to smear any particular sect or subsect or school of a religion as being the problem religion. After all, the Salafis are in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the GCC countries. They are all, at least Saudi Arabia and Qatar are Salafi Wahhabi countries. And the GCC countries also have a huge number of Wahhabi local population. Still, we have very good relations with those countries. A lot of Indians and people of all communities live there. It's a very cosmopolitan place. Increasingly, it is becoming so. However, the increase of the Ahle Hadith ideology would help ISIS to draw members directly, because ISIS does not like the Devbandis or the Hanafis. It does not like the Taliban. But if the Salafis are growing in number with these schools in Pakistan occupied Kashmir and inside Kashmir, the recruits for ISIS would only increase. And so this non-violent movement to spread the theology of ISIS is a problematic issue. Now, there are also, as you know, many other groups in Afghanistan. The Jamaat Ansarullah is increasing its footprint. The Jaish-e-Mohammed is having its camps in Nangarhar, LET. So Afghanistan is becoming a hotbed for international terrorism. And now that America has left Afghanistan, no major power will be willing to come and fix the situation in Afghanistan. And to me, Taliban 2.0 is perhaps a bigger challenge than even a greater revolution than the Iranian Revolution of 1979. I fear that it might become much bigger and snowball into a much major problem. And the world has to look at this very seriously. In India, we have found that the number of suspects is increasing. Officially, 160 odd people migrated to ISIS. Sometimes this figure comes down to less than 100. So there is a lot of variance in the security agencies' figures about how many ISIS fighters are there, how many people migrated to ISIS territories. But we find that, as I told you, that international sources say that active fighters, 66 of them are of Indian origin. A lot of people from Kerala have migrated to Afghanistan. One of the bombers of a Gurdwara in 2020 was a Muslim from Kerala. And so even in the recent, we just had our Independence Day, but the ISIS did issue a threat against about doing something big in India. Fortunately, thanks to our security forces, nothing happened. But the problem is only getting bigger, and we should take this threat very seriously. I would just end it here, and thank you very much for listening to me so patiently. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adil. It was very illuminating. He brought out very subtle differences between various groups, IS versus as well as all other groups. And most important thing which I would certainly like to highlight is that yes, there is a competition for growing influence. And yes, they see Taliban as a lesser jihadi. And therefore, and since they are better masters, and if you recall, they were the ones who actually revolutionized the terrorism in a manner that they were technologically enabled, they were cyber enabled, they could perhaps orchestrate wolf warrior attacks, and isolated individuals could also be recruited from almost all countries. So that's one part of it. And one thing which I would like to highlight, although Dr. Adil has got his figures, but compared to, if I look at broadly, compared to the fact that India has the second largest Muslim population in the world, if you take that proportion versus the number of guys who have gone to ISIS, I will go by his earlier statement when he said that this idea does not resonate as much as ISIS or ISKP would like it to be. So perhaps there are checks and balances, but notwithstanding that, it's a serious matter, as he rightly mentioned, and we need to look at it very seriously. I believe that he has to leave. So I will also, now he mentioned and he linked it to say that there was, they also affected Bangladesh. So I'll break the sequence slightly to say that we will now request, thank you very much, Dr. Adil. I'll now request Dr. Mubasir Hassan. He is an adjunct research fellow in Humanitarian and Development Research Institute in Australia. He is author of books that is Islam and Politics in Bangladesh. Is follower of the Followers of Ummah, that I think is the title of his book. And he has been a member of Research and Advisory Council in United States Institute of Peace, Washington, D.C. Incidentally, I happened to visit this USIP in context of United Nations. A very avid speaker and a very renowned speaker. I would request him to make us understand or to help us understand the youth radicalization in Bangladesh and what you make out of the footprints of the AQIS and ISKP in your part of the country. Over to Dr. Mubasir.
Thank you, Major General. I am truly delighted and grateful for this invitation, and this is my first ever engagement with Indian audience. So truly, it's a to me, it's a very encouraging moment. I wanted to share my PowerPoint. I don't know how to do it. If anyone could, or I could just talk it out.
So just open it, and there is a slide share. Just click that slide share if you can.
Achha.
Otherwise, if you find it too difficult, then even your speech can also go through. That's not a
All right. Okay.
I would request you to restrict your talk to about 15 to 20 minutes.
Sure.
So that we get some time for question answers later.
Sure. Maybe I will just, I'll just talk it out. Maybe this is the best way, but I would have sometime later, if there is any other opportunities to share, I would share it. So the talk today is about youth radicalization in Bangladesh. And I'm not really, I'm not really going to talk about the terrorist organization because I'm not an expert on terrorist group, but what I'm expert of is that the phenomena of radicalization and how youths move towards radicalization. So, you know, in the past few years, there have been several cases of Bangladeshi youths being engaged in terrorist activities. So, for example, there is one guy in 2017 Akadullah, who tried to blow up a train station in New York. And then there is in our country, Australia, there is this 27-year-old female Bangladeshi student who came to study in Australia, stabbed one of the person with whom she was sharing home, and then we all know about the Holy Artisan attack. So all this indicates that there is this really youth fascination and terrorist activism, and all this indicates that they were engaged. They did interpret the religion in a violent manner. And not only terrorist activities took place abroad, there are terrorist activities in Bangladesh. The secular bloggers, writer, publishers in Bangladesh have been murdered in a sporadic killing campaign. And then, you know, there are regular attacks on Hindus in many forms. We recently wrote an article in the Foreign Policy magazine about how since 2013, in a regular, every year, Hindus are attacked in some parts of Bangladesh. And what we wanted to understand, and also let me give you a bit more background detail of who are the militants, and this is based on a study by Dr. Ali Riaz and Simon Parvez, and they found that and they studied 150 profiles of alleged militants who were arrested by the Bangladeshi law enforcement agencies, and they found that 94% of them are between the age of 18 and 40. Only 2 were women, and 75.4% of those alleged arrested militants were from middle and upper middle class, and professional, and their educational backgrounds are both from secular and madrasa education. And professionally, they found that they were engineers, businessmen, teachers. 2 were described as IT expert, and there were security guards, garment workers, rickshaw and auto rickshaw pullers, laborers, bus driver, fruit vendors, and only 3 were imams. So you could see that there is quite a lot of diversity within the profiles of the arrested alleged militants, and some and there were also from notable family background. Some of the fathers of these alleged militants were high-ranking government officials who were working in judiciary or military officers. For example, Navy commander. And these are the profiles of alleged arrested militants. And then there is another study another researcher who studied profiles of alleged militants, the alleged dead militants who are dead by shootouts. And they found that most are again between 18 to 40, oldest were aged 50, and most are male. But in this slightly more, 9% were female. So 9% of those alleged militants out of sample 90 were female. And their educational background includes 73% from secular institute. They were studying BBA, MBA, computer science, engineering at honors and master's level. Only 27% are from madrasas, but still, if 27% of 90 dead militants, it's quite a big number. So one could see that the educational profile of all these sort of militants run across all across the society. And then there are 2 dual nationalities. One was Canadian and another one is American. And there are key terrorist outfits of these militants include Jamatul Mujahideen. This terrorist organization was linked to Pakistan group Lashkar-e-Taiba. They carried out coordinated bombing attack across the country on 17th August 2015. And police have arrested hundreds of JMB members. They have executed every member of its original leadership, including founder Sheikh Abdul Rahman. JMB focused its attacks on government officers, particularly courts and judges. It had no broader jihadi agenda, nor was they interested in indiscriminate. They're more interested in indiscriminate civilian casualties, and they have 2 wings. One for Dawa, religious outreach, is stressing the need for Islamic law, and the military wing, whose members called Eshar and underwent rigorous training. And then there is this another generation of Islamists came into Bangladesh. They are neo-JMB, and as Dr. Adil Rashid said, they are mostly, we can't rule out they're not ISS. But Bangladeshi government is particularly focused on that they are IS. They are not IS because of international image. So the leadership of this neo-JMB thought to be led by a Canadian Bangladeshi, Tamim Chaudhry, and another one who is responsible for this holy artisan attack is a Bangladeshi Hindu turned Muslim. And then he was in Japan. He named his name Saifullah Ozaki. He was teaching Islamic finance in a Japanese university. And the operational pattern of this neo-JMB or ISS is divided into regional commandants. They targeted army barracks surrounding areas of the Dhaka cantonment, and former Islamist and meritorious youth who were going to coaching center. They focused on them. They tried to recruit them, and then there is a big engagement in online recruitment, and they were responsible for Gulshan Cafe attack. And the other front of militant activities in Bangladesh were carried out by Ansarullah Bangla Team, ABT, who were influenced and encouraged and perhaps sponsored by Al Qaeda. They reportedly began as an online community inspired by the American Yemeni extremist preacher Anwar al-Awlaki, and they soon began to identify itself as the Bangladesh chapter of Al Qaeda. From 2013 onwards, its campaign resulted in murders of secular bloggers, writers, authors, journalists, gay rights activists in their homes and public places. And in their view, they offended Islam. And their members include urban, generally don't know each other, and when they do know, they know by only their pseudonym. A coordination team divided, and researchers found that they have three coordinate. They run the organization according to three coordination groups. One is Dawa, which oversees logistics and online recruitment. Second is Askari, which oversees military training, which includes a subgroup Mashul, which plans and oversees attacks. Foot soldiers and called Mamur, and a media wing run by IT experts that collates domestic and international coverage of the group. So that is the context of militant activities in Bangladesh. Now let me talk about my research. What I found, and as I told you, I didn't study the militant outfit. Rather, I was interested on what Bangladeshi youth, university-going youths and madrasa going youths are thinking about violence, Islam, and terrorism. Because I think all those the example I've given, they all were carried out by the youth. So I thought there must be something going on, and my research was funded by the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Stabilization through Resolve Network. So I conducted 4 focus group discussion and 10 in-depth interviews, and the Center for Genocide Studies at Dhaka University, run by Professor Imtiaz. He collected 150 micro narratives of Bangladeshi youths. I've also, as I was a fellow, I also used those. So let me talk about the narratives that came out from this research. One is that there is a growing sense among the participants that Islam needs to be protected from a minority cultural invasion. And unfortunately, what is minority is that this radicalized youth thinks that this minority, they're only bothered about Hindu minority. And one of the places of cultural, one of the front of cultural clash was the Mongol Shobhajatra, which is a traditional procession that takes place every year to celebrate the Bengali New Year. And in that Shobhajatra, or in that procession, supersized replicas of birds and various deities are shown and celebrated by the Dhaka University and Fine Arts students. And the thing is, our interview, especially those 150 interviews with that collected micro narratives from Bangladeshi youth, they were majorly focused on secular universities. So students were studying in Dhaka University, students were studying in Jahangirnagar University, like all very well-known secular institutes. They came out with such a very conservative view. So, for example, one student said that we don't accept Mongol Shobhajatra. It is a kind of cultural invasion. So when they say cultural invasion, they tie it with Hindu religion, and when they say Hindu religion, they locate it, or they try to trigger it to they point it to India. The same thing was done by Christian force during the crusade against Muslims. So they think that it is a cultural invasion. And also in my interview, what I've done is that I've organized a focus group discussion with a group of young groups and who are university studying, or who are studying in the university, because I think how the religion, because my background is, I'm from a majoritarian background, so I wanted to understand that what they feel and think about how Islamic terrorism and radicalization affecting them. So there, and I found that fascinating micro stories. So for example, one of my former students who was living, sharing their flat with a Muslim roommate, and she is female and she is from Hindu religion. And she says that, even my roommate does not pray. She did not allow me to keep my Hindu deity, Hindu God in my room. To her, she said that her Muslim roommate said, if your Hindu God is in my room, then my Islamic God will not enter. You could put aside this is that mundane, naive discussion among two, but if then there are other Hindu students of mine who said that similar thing happened to them when they were celebrating their puja festival in a district called Noshtingdi. They found that the Muslims came in and they said that please turn down your volume. So you could see that what happens in a small flat about the how religious freedom of minorities are violated, that goes that extends to the public spaces, and those mentalities are being manipulated by the terrorists, and they recruit. And but this is not only so we found that while this sort of narrative and mindset exists, but there are also counter narrative. For example, this problematic and highly controversial Islam, one of the leaders told me that they want Islam commands protecting minority faiths. And they told that idol worshippers can place their idols in their private places, in their mandirs, which is Hindu temple, adding that Islam even commands us to protect those houses and mandirs. While in the face, you could see that it is not that problematic, but to me it's highly problematic, because in Bangladesh, Hindu Muslims all have the similar constitutional right. What these guys are doing is that they are constructing an Islamic majoritarian religion, and the way they are constructing that, they are undermining the right of religious freedom in the country. Now I'm coming to the second part of the research. And while we see that there is this rise of majoritarian mindset among the youth, there is also a lively and problematic discussion going on among the Muslim youths about who is a good Muslim and who is a bad Muslim. What is the correct way to practice Islam? And for example, in one of my focus group discussion, I've seen two hijab wearing female youth started to engage in heated discussion, because one was wearing hijab with jeans and t-shirt, and one wearing hijab with more Arab oriented dress. So to the Arab oriented dress, the one who was wearing with hijab with t-shirt and jeans are not really real Muslim, and she is a good Muslim. And then I've also interviewed one of my students, still plays in a rock band called Infidel, and he believes that the music he's playing is very much bad. He's going to hell. So you could see that through this discussion, there is a discriminatory thinking going on among the people, and all, at the same time they are rejecting the liberal play, like the music and other sort of stuff, in the name that this is not Islamic. But we didn't find anything in the Quran that says that music is un-Islamic. And then finally, I think what is interesting is that I found a student whose brother was killed by Bangladeshi law enforcement in allegation of being militant. And his life story says that his quest of trying to be good Muslim led him to these sort of militant activities. So that and the story is that he got a divorce, and he changed his family, he changed his friends, and then he started to pray differently, and he started to cultivate new set of friends. and he came out with all sorts of strong and rigid idea of what Islam is. And this sister told me that my brother used to pray before, but suddenly there was a change in his praying pattern. He started to put both hands over his chest, and instead of his stomach, that is Hanafi style. Apparently, the brother felt that he was following a more authentic form of Islam. And she found it that because I'm a believer too, yet we seem to follow completely different religion. So what it brings us to us, that what are the drivers of violence in Bangladesh? First is that there is a social relation of influence, a new relationship, friends, families, husband, father, parents, siblings, teachers and private tutors tend to be recruiting this sort of recruiting them to the militant activities. And then there is this broken relationship and heartbreak paradigm, where broken relationship, one of the militant of Holy Artisan attack moved to militancy after having a broken relationship. Divorce, separation of parents, this all plays into this part. And there is this perennial search for whatever is good, authentic, and pure Islam tends to put them towards militant, but not all, few. And then there is this external connection, migration, diaspora connection. There are cases from where people went to Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, US, UK, Canada, and came back being militant and injecting those ideas. And internet, Facebook, Skype, Telegram, Twitter, Instagram. And in Facebook, there is this Islamic Learning Forum. This group played a role in encouraging interesting Bangladeshi jihadists to travel to Syria, Iraq, and fight for ISIS. And these are the micro driver. What is the macro driver? So I'll finish with this. The macro driver is that there is this clientelism, democratic deficit, authoritarianism, and rise of radical terrorism. So the International Republic Institute, a Washington DC-based think tank, they studied 4,000 Bangladeshis for 3 years, and they found that there is a positive correlation between the current authoritarianism and radicalism in Bangladesh, but they didn't share it with the authority, but they did share with the researchers privately. So in Bangladesh, all major indicators for measuring a liberal democratic contest show that it's not is going to regress one. And there are two views that contributes. One is anti-Western view and one is anti-Indian view. And for some reason, many actors trying to cultivate this sort of thing. And in one of the books that I've co-edited, which is South Asia, Radicalization in South Asia, two Indian researchers contributed a chapter, and they studied particularly the literatures of terrorist outfit, and they found that in Bangladesh they use anti-Indian narrative to recruit them. I think many of you are eminent practitioners, so you already know this. I'm not going to overwhelm you with this known invasion. And then finally, I think what is interesting is that there is no anti-China view, which is quite interesting. They put so many Uyghurs in camps and stuff, but they're always focusing on something called Islamophobia in the West, that it exists, but it doesn't, their laws are strong here, and also whatever happening to the Muslims in India. And that perhaps is an interesting way for you to further understand why there is one country is being pointed out, because as far as I understand, most Muslim Indians that I know are very much patriotic. But if you talk with Bangladeshi who are radical or who are like Islamist activists, they always point to India. That I never understand that what is the case. So I raise my case here with eminent in front of you. And thank you so much again for your kind invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mubashir. It was a good insight in a manner that you explained us the intricacies of various social groups, various minority, majority, what is going on in the mind of people there, and how perhaps the trend of radicalization is. And you also brought out, I think, some very interesting questions in the end, which we may like to discuss during the question answer session. Because I'm also curious to know from you as to why is it that Uyghur takes the backseat, and all of a sudden you find that in India the criticism grows much more. Secondly, the trend of and the, shall I say, intensity of the terrorism or terror activities in Bangladesh, that has been going up and down with various governments. Now, I find in your paper, did you ever come across or did you ever perhaps recommended anything of mutual cooperation or cooperation between countries in South Asia to tackle the menace of terrorism? Because as we all say, that all these groups, in fact, most of the groups, whether we talk of IS, whether we talk of AQIS and things like that, they have footprints everywhere. So you can't deal with them in penny pockets. There has to be a regional cooperation approach. So in case you had something, I will get back to you after the next speaker has finished, and then perhaps we will take on those questions as well. So now it's my privilege to invite Dr. Dheeraj. He is an assistant professor at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations in Manipal University, that is Manipal Academy of Higher Education. His doctorate is on intelligence studies, and he has done it from University of Leicester, UK. And he has worked a lot on roles and dimensions of the intelligence and counterintelligence to undertake the counter-terror operation. He's also an author of an upcoming book on the same subject with the strategic dimension. So now I would request Dr. Dheeraj to enlighten us on what he thinks about Pakistan deep state and the terror outfits, how they are booming in South Asia in general. Over to Dr. Dheeraj.
Thank you, General. Good afternoon, all of you. I thank Indic Researchers Forum for this opportunity, and I wish you all a very happy Independence Day. So the topic given to me today is the deep state in Pakistan and terror outfits in South Asia. Now, this is a topic that's pretty well spoken about. Most people across the world today are quite aware of the kind of sponsorship that the Pakistani deep state offers, or Pakistani state offers to terror groups operating across South Asian countries, most predominantly India, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. Today, I will be revisiting this topic, but not so much in terms of the terror outfits per se, but the larger ecosystem through which the deep state has been able to fund and operate these terror outfits in South Asia. So first, what we need is a holistic diagnosis of this problem. I mean, what is this Pakistani deep state, and how does it actually come in contact with these terror groups that we know today that harm the national interests of the three countries that I mentioned, that is Afghanistan, India, and Bangladesh. Academically speaking, generally when we talk about the concept of a deep state, it is believed that a deep state is an entity of individuals or a society of individuals who are known as a state within a state or a 10th state above a state. That is, they control the overt arms of the state, they control much of the policy making, and they also control the governments of the state as we know it, in order to sort of maintain or protect a certain vision they have for that particular state. So what is this vision, and who is this deep state in India? So when we ask this question, I think most of us would generally say that it is the Pakistan army that constitutes the deep state in Pakistan. And one of the reasons why we say that the Pakistan army is what constitutes the deep state in Pakistan is because we have seen repeated military coups in Pakistan, starting from 1953 and then 1969, then 77 and so on, until the latest being in 1999 when Pervez Musharraf came to power. So this gives us an understanding that it is, for those of you who are not aware, I'm not using a PPT, I'm just talking generally, so you would have to just listen to me. Thank you for that. So yeah, going back to where I was, so the repeated occurrence of military coups with brief intervals of democratic governance, there is a tendency to believe that it is the Pakistan military which constitutes as the deep state of Pakistan. And they also overthrow these democratic governments through what we call as the doctrine of necessity. That is, they use the pretext or they use the language of national security and something known as the idea of Pakistan. And in order to protect the idea of Pakistan, they feel it is necessary for the military to take control of the overall governance of the nation, right? So when militaries across the world take over governance, right, they have to ensure that both internal security is sorted as well as external security is sorted. And in that regard, what they do is they sometimes invent external enemies who do not exist. For instance, when they speak about the idea of Pakistan, they say that the partition is an incomplete business, and so that can only be fulfilled when Kashmir is liberated and made part of Pakistan. Similarly, they always portray India in terms of an existentialist threat that has to be taken care of, and the only entity within the Pakistani establishment that can actually ensure Pakistan's security is the Pakistan Army. But we all know today that that's not the case, and the best example is what happened in 1971. Right, in 1971, we see that Bangladesh was created, but it was not as a consequence of India wanting to create a state. What exactly happened was a democratically elected government was not allowed to come to power because it represented largely the East Pakistanis, the Bengalis, who do not fit the narrative of the true idea of Pakistan or the identity of Pakistanis. And so the military that took over power to ensure that the East Pakistanis don't take over power is what led consecutively to riots and the genocide that followed, where India was forced to intervene and create Bangladesh. But here, there's something important that happens in the year 1971 and subsequently until 1979 when the Soviet-Afghan war breaks out. This is where Pakistan realizes the so-called deep state, right? It starts to expand its network. And this is where we need to understand this, because today when academics talk about deep state, we're not talking about a single entity, but how that entity manages to survive itself through establishing certain networks, or by growing its tentacles in and seeding their people into various organs of the state. So first and foremost, that is where we see the Pakistani intelligence agency, which is the Inter-Services Intelligence. To some degree, it was the Intelligence Bureau as well, but by and large, it was the ISI, which is also part of the Pakistan Army, who started to make coalitions or build alliances with certain Islamist parties, right? That year, 1979, also coincided with certain global developments, as in we saw the Iranian Revolution, the coming of the Ayatollahs in Iran, and also there was an attack on the Holy Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So there were certain tectonic shifts happening within the Islamic world as well, and taking that into consideration, as well as the Soviet-Afghan war, and also remembering the bitter experiences of the 1971 war, the deep state decided that in order for the deep state to survive, to continue its survival, they would have to use Islam as a particular shield. They would have to use Islam as a sort of pill to be injected or to be given to several other organs of the state, not themselves, because they don't want the army to be completely Islamized, because they want to be a secular force. They want, even today, when you look at the Pakistani army, many of the students don't go to madrasas. They are educated in foreign universities and so on. But they wanted to ensure that the Pakistani state, the Pakistani political institutions, political parties are significantly Islamized so that they can have a control over them. So that's when they began to side with certain political parties, and also creating certain Islamist groups such as Lashkar-e-Jhangvi or Sipahi-Saiba Pakistan and so on. These were principally Sunni Muslim groups meant to target the minority Shias, because one of the reasons was if the Bengalis could create ruckus and eventually have a state of their own, the fear was that once once the Islamic State of Iran was established following the revolution, the fear was that a similar possibility is possible even in the state of Pakistan, which had a significant Shia minority. So for all these reasons, that's for the first time we actually saw that the so-called deep state, which had some linkages with the Jamaat-e-Islami, then started to make inroads and have alliances with the Jamaat Ulema Islami, which was mostly a rural group, and through them come up with all these groups, which Sunni groups, which then started to target the minority Shia groups and other groups in Pakistan who are mostly not considered Muslims at all. So that is one aspect. At the same time, they also, what the deep state also did was, they started to train and build alliances with certain other groups which are mostly India focused and Afghanistan focused. For the groups that are mostly India focused are what we famously know as the Jaish-e-Mohammed, as well as the Lashkar-e-Taiba and so on, who then started to have alliances with several other domestic terrorist organizations in Kashmir, as well as I wouldn't say they had an alliance with the Pakistani terrorists, but still the deep state did have some bit of they did provide some bit of support to the Pakistanis, which I'll come to shortly. So that's where we see the growing nexus between the deep state and the terrorist organizations, the South Asian terrorist organizations. But whenever we talk about a deep state, it'll be it is not complete for us to just talk about the deep state and the militant groups, right? Because the deep state thrives on a certain networking, certain system that allows these terrorist groups also to operate. And that is where we see that, like any other deep state across the world, the Pakistani ISI has seeded some of its operatives even into the Pakistani judiciary, as well as they've drawn alliances with some of the organized criminal groups, right? So if you see the kind of verdict that was given against for the killer of Daniel Pearl, or for that instance, the way in which Nawaz Sharif himself was ousted, I mean, Nawaz Sharif, the verdict that was given to Nawaz Sharif in the case of corruption and so on, it is highly ludicrous, because the judge just said something like, this person is not being honest. No court in the world will speak in terms of honesty and so on, which is derived from the religious text, right? Courts operate on the basis of evidence, and then verdicts are delivered. So all this could happen only because the Pakistani ISI had then seeded had infiltrated all these organizations and put their best men there. Similarly, by linking themselves with the organized criminal groups, it was initially for in order to draw monetary financial benefits from the illicit narcotics trade that was happening between Afghanistan, Pakistan, India to the Golden Crescent Route, and subsequently the drugs were then the heroin was then sent to the Western markets. But gradually they realized that there is a larger utility with these organized criminal groups as well. I'll come to that shortly. So all this was going on till say 2001, until the 9/11 attacks happened, because this is all a South Asian matter which the Western nations did not have to worry about much. But what happened since the 9/11 attacks is slightly more complicated. Pakistan was forced to take a serious stance with regard to the global war on terror, but somehow under the leadership of Pervez Musharraf, they had tactfully handled the situation by handing over a few terrorists who they felt that were not critical for Pakistan's or the deep state's vision, as we know it now. But then coming close to 2008, when the 26/11 attacks happened in India, that was there were some certain consequences which the Pakistani deep state had not anticipated. Many of the states, especially European states, who were sort of neutral when it came to when they were sort of neutral when it came to the question of terrorism in South Asia, because they always saw this as some sort of an India-Pakistan problem, right? Because what Pakistanis had always done was connected to the Kashmir problem, which was seen as an unfinished business of partition, and hence the Westerners always believed that it was a South Asian problem in which both Indians and Pakistanis were culpable, right? But the moment 26/11 attacks happened, and over 50 people who died in that attack were foreigners, mostly from the Western countries, the Europeans woke up to the reality of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? They started to learn about the Lashkar-e-Taiba. Western diplomats began to make efforts to know what the problem of Kashmir is, what the problem of militancy in this region is, and so on and so forth. Now that is something that the Pakistani ISI had not anticipated. So what the ISI did at that point in time was that they came up with the fourth dimension of what we need to understand today, because the fourth dimension is the most critical dimension that we in India face today. That is, they started to see scholars into Western universities and Western think tanks, right? Most of you would not know this. Moeed Yusuf, who's the current hand, who's been the National Security Advisor of Pakistan for quite some time now, he was part of this organization called United States Institute for Peace, which was an American public-funded think tank, right? And they have ensured for a very long time, under his probably thanks to his participation and that of many others, that there was simply no voice coming out of the United States or these think tanks which were critical of Pakistan, right? So this is not something that the Pakistanis alone have done. All right, if you go back to 2007, 2008, when Brahmachalani first came up with a term called string of pearls, we saw a lot of Western scholars actually ape that terminology and use it regularly. But today you see that when China has grown into this mammoth, sort of a monster that the West is trying to fight, you don't see such kind of terminologies being used by Western scholars today. And that's precisely because of the money power that the Chinese have been wielding in some of the institutions there. So similarly, what Pakistanis have been doing is they have regularly funded all these universities and think tanks. And while these fundings have been happening, what they've also done is, as part of what the Pakistani ISI terms as a fifth generation warfare, they have made use of some of these organized criminal groups, not only domestically, but also internationally, to target dissidents, right? So this is an important aspect here, because I mean, I did my PhD in the UK, and so I've seen it from close quarters how things operate there. Many of the research work that is conducted on Pakistan, especially in the context of counter-terrorism, national security, and so on, they do not happen without the approval of the Pakistani ISI, right? So when it happens through the approval of the Pakistani ISI, you know what exactly you're reading. It's a state narrative. But when the Pakistani ISI, but if you are a scholar who does not adhere to these set rules, that if you do not play by the bidding of the establishment, then the consequences are drastic. My sympathies are there with those Pakistani scholars, but they're few and far between, and there is a massive street power that the Pakistani ISI uses in the Western capitals as well. So if some of you have time, and if you would like to, if you can go on Google, you can find that there are a lot of reports of the British MI5 as well as the Metropolitan Police actually sending out warning notices to several scholars in the UK, and similarly in the US as well, that there is a serious threat, and these scholars have to report all of the movements wherever they go, right? So when we are talking about South Asian militant groups, right, we can always limit ourselves to groups like LET, JEM, and say that these attacks have happened, say the Parliament attack or the 26/11 attack, and keep talking about the same things. But then since 2014 and on, we haven't seen that many number of attacks, except for a Pulwama or a Dori attack. We haven't really, or couple more, of course, but we haven't really seen the magnitude of attacks that happened previously. So that might induce a sense of complacency in us, but where we need to stay clear is by understanding the nature of this problem. The problem is that when you talk about the deep state and its relationship with the South Asian terrorist outfits, it is not a single linkage that we're talking about. It's an entire ecosystem. So it is an ecosystem that constitutes the Pakistani judiciary. It constitutes the organized criminal groups, as I was talking about. It constitutes academia and influence groups globally, right? And it also constitutes the killing of dissidents abroad, which is now started. So, but what is the state of terrorism in India today? Today we see that for most part, terrorism has come down drastically in India. State-sponsored terrorism continues to be a threat, but it's come down drastically. What we see today is the Pakistani establishment trying to use exactly what they use in Pakistan, that is that of street power, right? So what is happening in Kashmir today? They use drones to airdrop not massive assault rifles, but just a pistol or so on, so that there can be targeted killings of certain people, right? The idea is to use these targeted killings to then instigate a grassroots level, to mobilize people at a grassroots level. So unlike the Maoists and other groups, right, who look for a massive rebellion, they want to brainwash people into believing that this is the right ideology we have to follow, and hence we have to take the path of rebellion. This is what the Pakistani ISI is trying to do right now. All that they're trying to do is through a couple of very well orchestrated targeted killings, they want the Kashmiris to raise up themselves. Similarly, exploiting some of Indian very well-meaning political moves, such as the farm laws and so on. They're using those to make sure that some street power that can be marshaled by certain groups that support the Khalistani movement in India. So they're trying to make use of them to ensure that peace and stability is harmed in India, so that then the vacuum that is created once the law and order system collapses, that can then be exploited by militant groups or terrorist groups that then infiltrate from across the border. So we are again back to the time of 1970s and 1980s, where somewhere our own policies were sort of double-edged, though we were well-intending, but we did give sufficient gaps for inimical forces to exploit, and I see ourselves back at that stage. But the larger question that we all need to ask ourselves is, why is this kind of a diagnosis important, right? Because in the absence of this, what has been happening is, at least since 1993, when the Bombay blast had happened, Indians have been very clear that we want the world to hold Pakistan accountable for something known as state sponsorship of terrorism. And that is something that has sustained even to this day. But unfortunately, that is unlikely to yield results, because the whole concept of state-sponsored terrorism, though the description of it might be dicey, it might lie in several factors, that is direct sponsorship or indirect sponsorship, just offering certain financial assistance, or even giving territory for terrorist groups to use, and so on and so forth. But the point is, when you're trying to counter state-sponsored terrorism, the language that is generally used by countries is that of morality, is that of global norms, and so on. But when we actually look at the responses, the only driving factor is that of national interest, right? So even though across the world there is an unsaid understanding as well as an acceptance that Pakistan does qualify to be a state sponsor of terrorism, it's never going to happen. Even there are studies conducted by American researchers, which are available on the internet, who do agree that Pakistan qualifies to be a state sponsor of terrorism, even from the criteria laid down by the United States State Department too. But they also agree that, from point of view of, say, defensive realism and so on, it makes sense for the United States not to go too strong against the Pakistanis. So that gives Pakistan a very easy, it can come up with n number of solutions to overcome this problem, right? In 1993, we saw that they could convince the CIA that that this is a problem of Kashmir, it's a problem of India and Pakistan. So what the CIA did was they had taken a piece of equipment from India to under the pretext of wanting to test if it was sold to Pakistan or not, and then they conveniently came back and said that it has been misplaced in the laboratory, right? And today, similarly, we can see that Pakistan is being tightened, its economy is being tightened with all the FATF verdicts and so on. But then all Pakistanis had to do was just share the location of Ayman al-Zawahiri, who doesn't contribute much to the Pakistani grand vision. So, by doing these piecemeal, through using such piecemeal tactics, right, Pakistan can overcome the problem that is posed by what we call a state-sponsored terrorism. So the solution actually lies in not emphasizing much on state-sponsored terrorism, in the sense that whenever given an opportunity at the global level, at the level of narrative, we do need to continue insisting on the concept of state-sponsored terrorism. But at the level of policy, I think that we also would benefit by describing the problem in as candid terms as possible. That is, this is not state-sponsored terrorism alone. This is clearly Pakistan's covert actions, right? The moment you say this is Pakistan's covert action, right, and this covers all the fronts that I was talking about, be it killing of dissidents, planting of narratives that are anti-India, that are that draw false equivalence between India and Pakistan and so on. Any of this that I was talking about, they all fall under the larger umbrella of covert action. The moment it is presented in these terms, as a scholar of intelligence, I can tell you that is when you develop strong counterintelligence measures, right? Say, for example, let me give you this example of Britain. Now, the MI6 is aware of the kind of nefarious activities that Pakistan is involved in. The MI5 is also aware of it, right? But which of the two organizations has a greater incentive to fight this kind of problem? It is the MI5, because they don't want, they are the ones who are serving these notices also to some of the dissidents, right, that you're going to be threatened. Because if a single individual is killed in the British territory, it is the MI5 that has to answer. It's a failure on their part. But for the MI6, the story is different, right? Because Britain today is not the colonial power that it was. So it has to find newer routes and new avenues to exercise its influence. And one of those ways is this perverse way of maintaining points of influence, if I may use that term. So what they do is they build liaisons with many of these agencies, with many of these dissidents as well. Dissidents in the sense, when I say dissidents, not the dissidents against the Pakistani state, but many of these dissidents were required, many of these criminals were required by the state. It is no surprise that today Vijay Mallya and many of those people have chosen UK and as the destination. So when we say state-sponsored terrorism and when we talk about information sharing mechanisms, right, we are principally focusing on foreign intelligence agencies cooperating with each other. But I think that the real solution lies in calling this as a covert action and a problem of counterintelligence, where we can get the United States FBI, or where we can get the Indian Intelligence Bureau, the British MI5, and many of these local agencies to cooperate with each other, because they have a real problem to deal with, right? So even when 26/11 happened, we may talk about a couple of warnings being shared by the CIA with the RNW and so on. But the fact of the matter lies in the fact that it was a massive counterintelligence failure. It was an internal security failure. So long as these internal security organs can of the entire globe can cooperate with each other to overcome this problem of terrorism, as well as subversion, I think the solution lies there. So here today, 75 years after independence, when we sit back and we reflect on this problem, I think that what we can achieve in terms of calling this problem a state-sponsored terrorism is far limited, though we should not stop those efforts. We should still continue those efforts, and those efforts will bear greater benefits if and when India gets an opportunity to be part of the permanent members of the United States Security Council and so on. But until then, I think that we'll have to consider this problem of covert action and ask ourselves, what are the likely responses that we can have? And that needs to be our own operations that are aimed to discredit all the efforts of the Pakistani deep state. So if there is a very strong Pakistani narrative that is anti-India, or that is drawing false equivalence between India and Pakistan, the question ought to be, what is India doing in that regard? What are Indian academics doing in that regard? What are Indian journalists doing in that regard? What are Indian intellectuals doing in that regard? So it should be a whole of government approach, and that can only come when there is an adequate appreciation of the problem, not just using the terminologies that the West would want us to use, while they're very clear that they're not going to do anything about it. So with that exposition, I'll stop it here. Look forward to any questions if there are. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a very well narration of and analyzation of the deep state, as well as the intricacies as to what all is involved. Let me just add a few things to say. That firstly, it suits the terrorism and the terrorists are strategic assets of Pakistan, as has been said by Musharraf. It suits, and they have used them to their advantage. And they have used them to their advantage against United States. For United States, they are also using them to their advantage against China. Because if China wants a warm water access, firstly you create a threat, and then you say that I'm resolving your threat, and then you say that I'm protecting your threat, and therefore I need more money. The second issue which you mentioned, let me take it in the strategic domain, as to why all these countries, whether it is UK or USA or China, and all these people are quiet when Pakistan does what it does. One of the reasons is the strategic location. And this strategic location, they have encashed enough. USA also wants that even subsequently, if it needs to get into the AFPAC region, or Afghanistan region, or in that portion of the Asia, the only logistic route is through Pakistan. And therefore, they do not want to close their entire relationship with them. And therefore, perhaps they will keep getting encouraged to what they were. Secondly, if you recall, when Pakistan was born, one of the incentives for British to divide India was that they knew that the entire India may not toe their line. If they can get a piece of land, which is now Pakistan, which is very well connected, at that point of time could be used against USSR at that point of time, which could also be made part of CETO and CENTO, and which can play to their tune, it was to their advantage. And that is why you will find that in Gilgit-Baltistan, which is common to China, common to CAR, common to Afghanistan, and common to Pakistan, that in that area, the British officer surrendered to Pakistan. And that's how we lost it. So therefore, it was a design, because Commander-in-Chief was a British, and he was playing both sides. Both sides, the game was being played in a manner that the outcome is that they get a footprint to checkmate USSR in the name of Pakistan. And from there, as you rightly mentioned, and very rightly you brought out as to why Pakistan army can justify that, okay, the existential threat, I am the only guy who can save you from India, because India has divided us once, they can divide us again. So therefore, you guys have to give me all the handles of power. And that's exactly what you alluded to. And you explained it so beautifully. So that is one part of it. The other thing which is becoming more dangerous and which I would like to highlight is that you see, whether we like it or not, yes, the terrorist incidents are coming down. At least the incidents, not the incident, but the major incidents have come down after we have put fair amount of restrictions on the terror funding, on intelligence, on separatists, etc., etc. But they have chosen a new form, and that is the social unrest. Utilize every protest to your advantage. And what they have found is that the moment you have a blast, like Udi or something else, or Pulwama, you find that entire India unites. But conversely, if you intrude into the farmer protest or you intrude into some protest and create a social unrest, then you find that there are divisions, and because of the vote bank politics, there are certain groups who will keep talking, and then there is a chain reaction which is set in motion. And that chain reaction does block a lot of things. After all, like it or not, the point was did got retracted. So therefore, this is by design. We have to understand this design and we have to have countermeasures. Like it or not, if a terrorist action takes place in India, there is no reason why we can say that we have not, maybe that we need to have stronger laws, maybe we need to have better intelligence, maybe we need to have better control, whatever we need to do. But certainly, we cannot keep saying that, okay, somebody else is doing it, it's not my problem. It is certainly my problem. That's one part. Now, I will throw open for questions, and
Sir,
subsequently, at the end, we will.
I'm sorry, sir. We have Dr. Rohan Gunaratna, sir. So,
Yeah. Okay, he is back.
yes, sir, he's there.
Yes, John. Okay, fine. Okay,
So,
so then
actually,
I thought that we somehow lost contact with him, so that's how I was moving ahead. But notwithstanding that, we have another very eminent speaker, Dr. Rohan Gunaratna. He is Professor of Security Studies in RSIS, that is Singapore. His master's from University of Notre Dame in US, also doctorate from the University of St. Andrews, UK. He is senior fellow for combating terrorism in United Nations Military Academy in West Point. He has written 16 books, a very well, shall I say, interviewed personality on terrorism affairs, and he has interviewed a number of terrorists also. So he has on-ground knowledge, and he has also been awarded for his expertise. He will be speaking to us on economic crisis and threat of extremism in Sri Lanka. We would like to hear from you before we end this session. Over to Dr. Rohan Gunaratna.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I will be focusing on three aspects. One is how Sri Lanka witnessed a regime change a month ago and the factors that led to that regime change. So the principal driver of the regime change was the economic mismanagement in Sri Lanka. And of course, the economic mismanagement had a cascading impact where a number of extremist groups infiltrated the civilian protests. So the protest itself took three stages. First stage was civilian protesters. This we can call a social protest. Second stage was a political protest because the political parties exploited the protest. And the third is what is called a militant protest. Militant protest is this violent organizations infiltrated the civilian protests, and eventually they attacked 120 homes of Sri Lankan politicians and other officials in one single day. And on another day, they burned the house of the then Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, who is now the President of Sri Lanka. So let me speak to you, focusing on both the economic, political, as well as the militant dimension of this conflict. One is that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to office in November of 2019 after a devastating terrorist attack that took place on April 21st, 2019, the Easter Sunday attack. It is the world's worst terrorist attack that the Islamic State or ISIS mounted outside Iraq and Syria. The mainstay of Sri Lankan economy is tourism. Tourism was crippled as a result of this terrorist attack. Tourism never really revived in 2019 after the attack. And of course, by 2020, we suffered from the COVID pandemic. So there were three blows to the Sri Lankan economy. One was the Easter Sunday attack in 2019 April. Then second was the COVID pandemic in 2020 and 2021. And then we saw that the Russia-Ukrainian war had an impact this year. So, because most of the Sri Lankan tourists come from, other than India, they come from Russia and Ukraine. So, we lost our capacity to sustain and revive the mainstay of the Sri Lankan economy because of this. But the civilian protesters that demanded government provide electricity because they were running 6-hour power cuts. They gathered, but later political parties saw an opportunity and they infiltrated the civilian protests and they came together. In fact, I would call it a horseshoe approach, where the left wing and the right wing started to work together. And eventually what happened is that a very militant organization infiltrated these civilian and political protests, and they conducted violence throughout the island because this militant organization can never come to power through the democratic constitutional political process. They can only come to power through violence. So the protests were very much, the brain of the protest was this group called the JVP and its student wing called the IUSF. So, and another party called the Frontline Socialist Party. These are the three entities, and it is members of these three entities with others who engaged in violence against the parliamentarians. Now, eventually what happened is the government realized that these protests are going to be a very significant threat. And on the 9th of July, government imposed a curfew, a police curfew. But this police curfew was declared illegal. And then the protesters start to come to Colombo. About 25,000 protesters overwhelmed the president's house and the presidential secretariat, and they occupied these two state buildings, and subsequently they also occupied the temple trees, which is the official residence of the Prime Minister, and they burnt the private residence of the then Prime Minister, who is the current president. So let me share with you that the peaceful protests are legitimate, but unfortunately we had various people calling these protesters peaceful even after they set fire to 120 properties. So there was also a geopolitical dimension because we saw that there were some geopolitical actors encouraging these protesters, and we saw eventually that the then president, who was democratically elected, who was very close to India, in fact, he had to leave. So today the new president is the Prime Minister, and he himself was nominated by Gotabaya Rajapaksa. What is interesting is that Gotabaya Rajapaksa had a huge reputation for ending the 30-year war in Sri Lanka. We had a terrorist campaign by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil, and it was one of the most brutal terrorist groups we have seen in history. It's the same group that assassinated Rajiv Gandhi, and this war was ended by Gotabaya Rajapaksa. But he was very reluctant to act against the protesters because he firmly believed that these are civilian protests. People were hungry and that's why they were protesting. Subsequent research clearly show that the people who are hungry stayed in their homes, but those who protested were largely funded by the NGOs and by the LTT International Network and various other elements. But what is interesting is that although Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to power as the man who ended the war, he was very careful in using force. In fact, the day his president's house was surrounded, he left, and he gave a very clear instructions to the military not to open fire. I will leave. That was his spirit. The man who succeeded him, Ranil Wickremesinghe, was different. Although he is considered liberal, he used extensive force against these protesters, dispersed them, and he has cleared that area today, Goldface. And not only that, there was a subsequent attempt to take over the parliament by the protesters, and when they came in strength, he instructed the deployment of the Sri Lankan air mobile troops, and these troops confronted the protesters, and about 150 of them ended up in hospital. 2 weapons were lost. 1 weapon has been recovered. Another weapon, government is still searching for it. But what is important is that the current president, the former Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, sent a very clear message that protests cannot be used to dislodge a democratically and a politically and a constitutionally appointed government. Because we saw the infiltration of these protests by the JVP, FSP, and IUSF, entities that participated in a subversive campaign from 88 to 89. In fact, when the Indian peacekeeping force came to Sri Lanka during that period, these entities, they fought against the government for having invited the Indian peacekeeping force. Not only that, they mounted attacks against the IPKF. The current leader of FSP, Kumar Gunaratnam, his brother was implicated in one of those attacks against the Indian peacekeeping force. So what we are seeing is that the current president has decided to take a tough stand. He don't want politically rejected organizations. He do not want fringe organizations to use protests to manipulate and come to power. Let me make two concluding remarks about the challenges facing Sri Lanka. One is that it is paramount for us to understand that the government should build what is called a Foreign Interference Act. If we do not build a Foreign Interference Act, various geopolitical actors will interfere in Sri Lanka. This includes India, includes the Europeans, includes the Americans and the Chinese. So our country as an independent country will be compromised if we allow this kind of interference. Certainly we should respect the national security concerns of all parties, but the geopolitical interference to change regimes is something that no one wants to contend with. Second is, other than a Foreign Interference and Influence Act, we also need to develop current laws or update our laws on protests. The British during the COVID period enacted laws to manage protests more effectively. In fact, today if someone touches a barrier that is separating the protesters from a state building, that person can be prosecuted. If someone jumps over a barrier, that person can be prosecuted. So we need to update and upgrade our laws on protests, because protest is a modern way of aggression and of making a point. I know that there is freedom of speech, freedom of demonstration, freedom of protest, freedom of assembly. But again, we have to be very careful who is behind this. Are these spontaneous or natural? Are they organized? Are there other elements that are behind it? So I think these two laws will stabilize the country. The final point that I want to make is that much of these protests were driven by fake news. The official term for fake news is online falsehoods and manipulations. We have to build legislation on how to counter fake news. Otherwise, fake news becomes real news. So in the Sri Lankan battle space, the military are masters of the physical space, Army, Navy, Air Force. But they didn't understand the social media space, what is called the information domain. And there was no effort to counter the misinformation and disinformation. I personally would attribute a lot of what happened not only to the economic crisis and the energy crisis, but also these other elements, other national security elements that are important. So I think it's too early for us to come to a conclusion on exactly what has happened, but based on the information that is currently available, I would say that we didn't have the far-reaching national security strategies to manage the economic fuel or the energy crisis. And of course, that was compounded by lack of capability to manage the protests and to manage foreign interference, especially through NGOs and other actors. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Rohan, in fact, you gave the Sri Lankan point of view and told us all about what happened as a Sri Lankan, which we respect. And I'm very sure Sri Lanka will very soon get out of this crisis in some manner or the other. And there are certain weaknesses of democracies at large, not only Sri Lanka, which are emerging out in such protests, because such incidents globally, they teach you something, that yes, freedom of speech is good, protests are good, protests are a safety valve in a democracy, there is no doubt about it. But then of late, they are being exploited by the non-state actors and by the terrorists as well. And therefore, they find that this is becoming more impactful, and it has become a lucrative industry also to utilize these protests, whether for political reasons or for other reasons. So therefore, yes, there is a very major, shall I say, shift in the operations of the terrorists as well, and they have become smarter to use the public dissent in the manner in which they can to create chaos in the areas, and that chaos can be used for whatever purposes they want. Now, the most important thing, firstly, are there any questions on the chat box?
Sir, we do have some questions, but I think we'll be running short of time. So if anyone has any question, they can post it and I can directly post it to the respected speaker.
We'll share it later.
Okay. So if that be so, then I will, or can we take on one or two odd questions? No.
Okay, so if anyone has any question, they can type it in the chat box and also mention which speaker you want to pose that question to.
Okay, and while you type questions, I will just flash one slide. The most important thing is what you want to do with the terrorism, and how do you actually control the terrorism. So therefore, I want to explain one slide to you.
Sure.
Is it visible? Is the slide visible?
Not yet, sir. Not yet.
Okay, okay, just a minute, just a minute. Is it visible now? Is it visible now?
Not yet, sir. You can't.
Okay, I'll just keep talking about it. You see, when we talk of terrorism, basically it is a group of people who are either suppressed unjustifiably, or religious fundamentalism, or misguided ideology, or socio-economic disparity. Now, broadly, these are the reasons where it starts. Now, for terrorism to prosper, you need ideology, you need a leader, you need interest groups, and you need non-state actors. Now, when these non-state actors, they fight for perceived cause, the fight could be in the form of ruthless, destructive behavior. It could be in the form of unpredictability. It could be irrationality. Now, what do they want? They want to acquire power. If they are successful, then they get power and legitimacy. Like Taliban has got power but not yet got legitimacy. If they are unsuccessful, then they continue that as an industry. So they keep moving in and out of the hideout, and they re-emerge at the correct opportunity. Now, what makes them going? For terrorism to prosper, you need financial support, you need support of population. Why population is important? Because you get intelligence, you get recruitment, and you get logistic support from population. Then you also need political support, you also need media and information or misinformation, as Professor was bringing out at the end. And you also need technological enablement and cyber. Now, if you want to stop terrorism or perhaps reduce terrorism, then you must cut out these 5 elements. That is financial support, people support, political support, media support, and cyber and technological support. So therefore, if we have to target, then we have to target this. And if we have targeted this, certainly the impact is visible. If you recall, even in Kashmir, when Article 370 was to be removed or abrogated, at that point of time, these elements which I mentioned, those 5-6 elements, these elements were taken care of, and therefore you did not see what you saw after killing of Burhan Wani. So this is at the strategic level when you want to control terrorism, this is what is required. And unfortunately, what happens is everything cannot be, yes, you need stronger rules. UA, PA and things like that, they have become little old. You need stronger rules and you need stronger laws. So all these, I think, will help. As a country, as India, we have learned our lesson. We are working towards it. You would have seen the kind of financial choking which has been done, and a whole lot of other measures are being taken, and perhaps we are on our way to improve the situation as best as we can. So I'll leave the session here, and thank you very much to all the panelists who gave such good insight of the subjects which they were given, and a fair amount of ground has been covered to understand as to how terrorism is mushrooming in South Asia and what are the future trends of terrorism in South Asia. And I'm sure the future session will take you through to a number of other areas and through the number of other subjects. So I thank all the panelists and I thank all the viewers for watching this session and listening to all the speakers so patiently and so wonderfully. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. I thank our session chair and each and every key speakers for such a thought-provoking and enriching session and providing a better and a clear insights on the decoding the terror threat in South Asia.